All right, psychology nerds, and welcome to another episode of Psychology and Stuff, the podcast from Good Cause Productions at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. I'm your host, Alison Jane Martingano, and today we're diving into one of the most transformative topics in higher education right now, artificial intelligence. These powerful and suddenly very everyday tools are reshaping how our students learn and how we think about teaching. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by someone who has been leading these conversations across campus, Dr. Paul Belanger. Paul is a faculty member in applied writing and English here at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay and the project manager of the university's AI think tank. With graduate training in writing pedagogy, creative studies, and digital humanities, he brings together insights from three different intellectual worlds. So you have a really diverse background in writing, in digital humanities, in creativity. And I'm really interested, when we're talking about AI, how do those different backgrounds sort of intersect to shape your view on artificial intelligence?
Interestingly enough, it would have been, 10 years ago now, maybe more, where I was first introduced to artificial neural networks, some of the technology that's underlying a lot of our large language models and other generative AI sort of endeavors. And this came through actually some studies that I was doing in creativity and how creative writers come about their process. And it started off actually looking at John Hersey's quote that when the writing's really working, I think something like dream is going on. And that led me to digging a little bit deeper into, okay, well, what is actually going on? Is there something like dream going on? And in that process, start to uncover all sorts of thinkers who have talked about the human brain as being a pattern recognition and creation machine. And then this led me to people like Margaret Bowden, who early on was looking at the intersections of computers and creativity, which then led me to this idea of artificial neural networks and connectionist sort of thinking. And so that was really kind of an aha moment for me and allowed me to start dreaming of, Borges' sort of labyrinth becoming real. And so while that was an early sort of connection to artificial intelligence, when we did have things like ChatGPT come on the scene, like in sort of this mad rush and like, oh my gosh, it was kind of a, well, here we are moment. And I looked back then at all of the other things that I had been doing, whether that was doing ideology mapping to make some electronic literature, whether that was those creativity studies or thinking about how the human brain learns. And they all kind of seemed to come together in this sort of beautiful nexus of this particular moment that we're in, and thinking about like, all right, well, computer scientists are trying to make machines that can think. I'm trying to decode how we actually think. And so there's a great sort of interconnection there. And it's been really exciting and frankly quite daunting, a little bit scary as well, trying to figure out how we navigate this. Because in my mind, the seeds have been planted. Actually, like a long time ago. We've been thinking about machines that can think for, at least like the 1300s, when we had, a poet who was actually saying, hey, look, I have a paper-based mechanistic way of creating new concepts, all the way through, say, Jonathan Swift's machine in Gulliver's Travels, and the creation of ideas where even the most ignorant man can sort of write philosophical treatise and law treatise and the like. And now we're at this moment, I believe, that we have to actually start thinking, well, what does that mean for us? And so those are some of the, I think that's that body of question that evolves from that. What's next? How do we adapt? How do we make sense of this? Really motivates me to pursue these types of questions, both in the creative arts as well as in pedagogy, and just more generally thinking about what this means for us as a peoples, as a society. What does it do to not just our brains, but to the connections that we establish with one another, and the sort of body of thought and creation that these machines are built upon.
Yeah, no, as you're talking, I'm thinking back to graduate school when I was being taught about how the mind works from a psychologist's perspective, and the idea that when computers were invented, that led to a lot of metaphor building of, the human mind is a computer. And then the shift away from that and like, well, actually, no, we're not much like a computer really at all, especially a lot of myths around memory. And, we don't store and retrieve memory in the same way a computer does. So tell me, with these new AI, are they more similar to human thought process, or are they just as far off as they ever were?
Yeah, well, I think that they are replicating parts of the human thought process much more evidently than maybe they have in the past, right? So as we've moved from sort of machine learning to now we have these generative, pre-trained transformers, that we are in a situation where we are very capable of replicating the pattern-making sort of dimension of the human brain. But we still don't have embodied experience. Memory certainly doesn't work the same way between a computer and a human still. And really, I mean, even if we look at the most advanced large language models, the memory that they possess is really more along the lines of almost like a system-type prompt. It's not the same sort of memory, episodic and otherwise, that we possess. So I think it's one of those things where we are, 100% closer, but still 100%, 100 miles away from the actual human mind. But I do think there is a sort of reciprocal relationship between psychology and computers. Certainly when we think of, you go to 1955 and Dartmouth, and you have people that are trying to, like McCarthy, saying, hey, we can make machines that think, or can we at least, right? And what would that look like? A lot of that based on what we thought we knew of the human mind at this time. And so I think that metaphoric sort of relationship has kind of allowed at least computer sciences to advance, right? And not always in a linear way, but learning and advancement isn't usually entirely linear.
No, and I love how you said sort of augmented there, because so, and this is probably going to come out very poorly, but if we've been trying to create a machine that can replicate the human mind for as long as we've been interested in doing this, and we've failed to, but we've created something that's in many ways as powerful, just different, right? And so then if we're no longer trying to make a human brain, but we're trying to make a brain or a system that does something slightly different and has things that it can do better than us and things that it doesn't do as well as us, and then marrying those two together to get the benefits of both worlds. Is that sort of where you see this going?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the advent, the sort of evolution of technology has been one of augmentation of human capabilities, from time immemorial. And there has always been sort of risk involved with that. There have always been those who are fearful of those changes. But I think that, we are tool users, and we have here another tool that can extend the abilities that, are naturally occurring in our biology and through our, sort of social upbringing and all the mix of things that come together to making a person. And, we've seen, I mean, you go back to Plato writing about Socrates saying, oh, we have this new technology of writing. I mean, not entirely new then, but that it is a dangerous technology, and it is going to lead to the sort of dumbing down of the population, because it is this mimic of intelligence and of memory rather than the actual thing. Right. I would argue actually writing has done a lot to advance the human race and what we are capable of knowing and expressing. And I think that artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, because there's a lot of different types of artificial intelligence, of course, is going to prove to be a similar type technology. The question is whether or not we can figure out how to harness it in a meaningful way. And that meaningful way not simply being that we'll feed it into the machine and see what you get on the backside. That's like opening up your toolbox, grabbing your hammer, and saying, oh, well, how do I use this? I just smash everything with it. Of course not. That's not how it works. But if used in a thoughtful and meaningful way, you can build entirely new structures with that hammer, or I think with these evolving technologies of generative artificial intelligence.
I love talking to you, Paul, because you always bring such optimism to this conversation that I feel is not usually full of optimism. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because you mentioned fears. And I was actually had the pleasure of listening to you speak at a panel here recently at UWGB, where you spoke with other Writing Foundation's instructors about how you're using AI with your students in your pedagogy. And I'd love it if you could speak to that a little bit, because I think a lot of naivety from outside of the world of writing instruction. We're like, oh my goodness, that must just completely have changed your job overnight. How could you possibly have coped with that change? And it seems like you and your department have taken this incredible optimism. So you can just tell me a little bit about how you are helping students to use AI creatively and still find their own voice.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'll start that by saying those fears that people feel are real. I feel them as well, right? And I think we need to honor that and to recognize that, because we are on the cusp of this radical sort of change. But when I'm working with the students, not only do I start by recognizing that, start by talking them through, hey, here's how these systems work. It's really like sort of statistical analysis that's spread out over these large vectors, and it's not quite as simple as a glorified autocomplete, but maybe that's an easy way to kind of like wrap your head around it. So what's missing here? Well, the human experience, the human spark, the joy that comes with creation, the ability to really target a specific audience. And so in having these conversations, I think the first thing that comes up is, for me, that our students are incredibly intelligent, and they're very switched on, and they're very sort of understanding of a lot of these risks. And then I think the next step is to think, okay, good, keep that, because we need to keep the friction. We need to put the friction into our relationship with the machine, because as we've seen, the machine wants to do nothing but please, like the sort of genie, right? We don't know what we're always going to get out the other side. But if we keep that friction there, then we get to keep that sort of human spark, rather than following that path of least resistance, which is like the siren song, so easy to fall into. And so starting with this conversation and what's threatened, what we might lose from it, our identity, our voice, as you mentioned, our own sort of creative prowess, then that opens up a space to say, okay, but where can we use it, right? And sometimes it's simple stuff. It is the modern day thesaurus, for instance, right? Or it is a new type of search. So I don't know about you, but the older I get, the sooner I forget things. And a lot of times I might be searching for a word or a concept, and I can sort of give the constellation of ideas that exist around it, but maybe I can't land quite on that. So I can go now to, my favorite, whatever my favorite large language model is, explain what I'm looking for, and they'll give it, oh, you're thinking about this thinker, you're thinking about this concept, here's the word you're looking for, maybe something close to it. So we have some smaller tools that we can use it for. But I also want to introduce them to the idea that we can use it as a way to converse with the median. We can use it as a way to converse with the sort of average. Because if we have a machine that's essentially looking at probabilities, right, within a context of tokens, we are able to sort of see what the average mind might come up with. And in understanding where that average is, I think we can push beyond it, and we can bring our own sort of beautiful human fallibility to it. We can find our own voice within it, and really craft messages and stories and poems that go beyond it. Now, to do that, it is always, we need to start with ourselves first. We have to, I think, locate the human as central to this entire endeavor. We are the progenitors of these machines. We are the users of these machines. And hopefully we will be around long after this technology has faded and the next one has replaced it. And so in doing this, it is, I tell my students, you need to come up with your own beautiful thoughts first. Don't go to the machine for your brainstorm. That is going to short circuit. It's going to create this sort of premature foreclosure on the possibilities that you are going to come up with your own divergent thinking, right? And it's essentially giving your agency over to an unthinking machine. We might call it artificial intelligence. We might anthropomorphize it in every single way, almost every other utterance, right, about this, but it's not thinking. It is not having these same sorts of experiences. So this is what you bring to it. So do your ideation first, and then you can invite the machine in to help identify gaps, to help you sort of talk through or think through where the strengths, where the weaknesses are, etc. Once you have an idea, I always instruct my students, listen, put it down on paper yourself. Right? The beauty of generative artificial intelligence isn't that it's a one and done, one shot sort of, hey, make this paper for me, write this paper for me, or write this poem for me. That's no good. But what it can do is it can help us interrogate our thoughts. We can use it as a mirror. We can use it as a conversational partner to dig a little bit deeper. And then when it gets to, we've actually generated something, we've maybe used it to get a little bit of feedback, and we then need to push back against that feedback, right? Because it, first of all, wants to please us, which I've mentioned already, right? That sycophantic sort of persona that so many of these have. So we have to push back against that, but we also have to push back against any language level suggestions it might make, because we need to position ourselves as that final decision maker. We're the only ones that can take responsibility for the things that we publish and put forward. The machine, being unthinking, not being an agent of its own, is not capable of doing that, right? And heaven help us if we ever get to a point where we start offloading our own personal responsibilities onto this unthinking machine. And for me, this comes down to very small language level decisions, right? So, of course, you've heard about the overuse of the en dash and the overuse of bolding and of lists within AI. Now, these are all excellent signifying strategies that we can use, but we have to use them thoughtfully, and they have to be our decisions to use them. If you just copy and paste, first of all, that's not your work. Those aren't your words. All sorts of maybe ethical questions that come up with that. But people are very quickly going to see the hollowness of the language and typically of the ideas themselves. And so this is where you have to push back, and you have to say, well, maybe that is the grammatically correct way of doing it, though it doesn't always get grammar right either. But that is not the human way of saying it. That's not my voice. That's not the sort of impression that I want to create. I also think that we need to think about our audience, right? I mean, this is something that we teach our writers all the time, or at least I do. Audience and purpose are paramount. And the machine doesn't have this sort of real understanding of that, even if we explain to them our audience. So we have to think about what they're going to be receptive to, what our relationship with that audience is, and what sort of marks are going to create the impact we're looking for, right? Because every mark we make signifies something. It matters. And so when we get down to this level, right, where we're actually in the text, the idea is, listen, be comfortable pushing back. Be comfortable exercising your own agency. Own that work, because it can only be yours at the end of the day. And, frankly, especially with my creative writers, why are you doing this? Right? If you are just doing this to sell a book, you're probably never going to sell any books, because what we respond to is that true human experience, those original human voices. So cultivate that, right? And push back, create those moments of friction, just as you would have to do if we were in a completely in-person writing workshop. Just because I tell you something isn't working in your story doesn't mean it can't work. Doesn't mean it's not something you should pursue. Just because another student says, oh, I think you need to change this word to something else, doesn't mean they're right. It's not their work. They don't get to make that decision. Only you do, right? And so if you can maintain that sort of that license and that power, that agency, then you can start to use the machine to augment the things you already do well and to drive them further. And in fact, I tell them, listen, when any time that I maybe take a piece of text to a large language model and I'll say, hey, I just need a little bit of feedback on this. How is this landing? What are you seeing? I mean, 9 times out of 10, I don't agree. But that act of disagreeing actually allows me to move faster, because I've been able to stress test my words. And I will just, in terms of a productivity tool, right? Which of course, this is really marketed as, and there's a lot of economic forces behind pushing these things. It has sped up my process because it allows me to get through that sort of hurdle in my own writing process where I haven't had maybe some outside pushback. So I'm always like in this sort of space of provisionality and a little bit unsure. But then I have somebody to spar with, or a thing to spar with. And then that helps me go, no, this is what I mean. This is how I meant to say it. Now, I don't think students are going to just naturally receive that. I don't think that's how they're going to use it naturally.
Yeah. I feel like when I'm hearing you talk about the importance of this agency and having this friction with it, and I completely agree, but I'm thinking of my students who, before ChatGPT existed, would come to me with a quote, and it would be a big quote within their paper, and I'd be like, can you paraphrase it? Put this in your own words. Right. And they'd say, well, no, because this is written perfectly. I can't improve upon this. I can't find a better way to say it. And I feel like they might get caught in that same problem, but with the words from the large language model. And it's that, I don't know, maybe it's a distrust in ourselves when we're still learning, that we're not confident. And so we think, oh, what it's produced must be the best.
Yeah.
How do you help them to get over that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, yes, it is about that not quite trusting yourself, right? As a writer, as a thinker, as a human being often when we're talking about some of our, early stage academics and professionals. And I think the other thing that we have to contend against is we often look at our machines as being infallible. right? We've become very trained to see these machines as being authorities in whatever vector that they're working in. And now that we're working in language, I think you're absolutely right. It's easy to say, oh, this reads smoothly, ergo it must, therefore it must be perfect. How could I possibly change that? But again, with a little bit of exercise, have them generate a poem or a paper or a small passage, and then show them how you can push back against that, and that it is not born infallible. And in fact, a lot of times it is really born hollow, and it's up to you as the human to fill it in, right? And to find ways to make the things that are being said your own. And again, though, that's why we start with our own words and our own beautiful thoughts. And I use that language, and I have been using that language even before the advent of ChatGPT, because I think as young individuals, we're often struggling with that. To sort of honor and value the things that we think and the things that we feel, especially because we exist in a world where that doesn't always happen, either in their education, in society, in their home lives. Going back to that old school traditional sort of children are meant to be seen and not heard sort of thing. And really that's not the case. And I think part of my job in teaching young minds and creatives is to help them recognize that. And so to use language like, no, your beautiful thoughts matter. What you have to say is valuable is a potent sort of approach to it. And likewise, another thing I think on a similar topic is if I'm teaching some students how to workshop, how to take a piece of writing, tear it apart, break it down into its constituent parts so we can build it back together into something else, they'll say, but who the heck am I? I'm not a writer. I'm not a thinker. Who am I to tear this apart, right? Very much like, oh, this block quote here is perfect. How could I change it or paraphrase it? Yeah.
Right.
And the answer is no, but you are the audience. You are the human that is receiving this, that is making sense of it, that is being caused to feel things by it. So even if you don't yet have the language to explain why you're feeling that way or why it's creating that impact, acknowledging that is the first step to figuring out, well, how do I explain that, right? And then take a stab at it. You don't need to have the exact language of literary studies or creative writing, methods and craft to explain how something has made you feel and to start digging into it. And then we're talking about these sort of metacognitive skills, the sort of skills that allow us to create friction, not just within language, but within the ideas that we are receiving and creating and projecting as well.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the AI think tank, which you chair here on campus, and I am proudly a member of. And that think tank really brings together faculty and staff with very, very diverse opinions and attitudes and thoughts about generative AI. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the purpose of the think tank and bringing all those different ideas together?
Yeah. Part of the reason the think tank was born is that we do have these very varied perspectives on what this technology means, where it's going, the threats involved with it, the promises, often overblown, of course, and to bring them all into a conversation with one another so that we can really push around the edges. I think that there are sometimes, when we're dealing with these types of technology, I think we can easily fall into that fight, flight, freeze sort of response, right? And so you will see early on, we would have professors that would say, no, it's completely verboten. It shall not be used in my classrooms. I won't touch it with a 10-foot pole sort of thing. And then we'll have others who just kind of like duck their head, pretend that maybe it doesn't exist. And then we'll have those actively fighting against it. And I think all of these are valid, and I feel them. But I think that if we can bring everybody that shares these concerns, as well as maybe some more optimistic perspectives into the room, we can sort through what's true, what's not. But more importantly, again, where do we go from here? What do we do with it? I don't think this is something that gets put back in the box. I think the technology is here. It's freely available to anybody that wants to host their own, large language model or distillation, image generating model. And so these things are going to be here, and we need to contend with them. I don't think just turning our backs is going to help us, right? And indeed, if they are the threat that even the biggest backers of AI suggest that they are, if you turn your back on that sort of threat, you're going to get stabbed in it. So I think instead the think tank is able to bring all these perspectives together so we can face it together head on and we can keep each other in check. This is, there's enough sycophancy going out there within the LLMs, within the sort of people that are promoting them and building them and have financial incentives and all these other things. That's not what we want. We want to create that sort of friction that I talked about earlier with our relationship with AI, but we want to have the sort of human version of that so we can figure out, well, what does this actually mean for grading, for teaching, for writing, for creativity in general? How can it be applied in fruitful ways so that the uses aren't foisted upon us? Because if we don't play an active role in the development of these technologies, at least in the ways that we use them, somebody else will figure it out for us. Somebody else is going to do that in a way that maybe doesn't rise to the same sort of ethical standards that we have, that doesn't follow the moral compass that's at the heart of not just the amazing faculty that's here, but I think at the heart of the university itself.
And one of the projects, of course, that the think tank was involved in last year was the Vitruvian machine project. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that showcased?
Yeah, the Vitruvian machine was a collaborative work with Drs. Chris Przicki, Chris Williams, and Abby Kleinert. The Chris's are in English, as am I. Abby Kleinert is over in our arts and design program. And it was an investigation of that intersection of what it means to be a creative in a day and age where we have these generative technologies that many people see as threatening the very livelihoods and the very sorts of skill sets that we've cultivated. And so, again, we decided, let's face this head on. Let's see what we can do with these technologies while still maintaining our own creative edge. And this took the form of a happening, a la 1960s sort of thing. We said, let's be weird with it, because especially at that point, it's gotten better, since then, but the outputs were often ridiculous. The types of hallucinations we would see in our large language models, the errors we would see in image generation where people have, 7 fingers and 2 heads and whatever else. It created that sort of really, really uncanny sense where it's almost there, but not quite. So what does this mean? We said, well, let's play with that. And a happening seemed to be the perfect way to not only highlight some of those maybe absurdities that occurred through those errors, but an interactive sort of event where people could come in and experience what it's like to work with these machines, not just as, one-shot sort of generators of images and papers and poems and all these sorts of things, but in a more collaborative nexus. So with this sort of being our goal, the actual event took the shape following the Vitruvian machine, right? Going back to Vitruvius and this idea that architecture should be based on sort of man, so that in particular the building of temples, right? And so that there's this sort of human divinity that goes into the building of our machines, which Da Vinci then took and expanded to the universe. Man is the measure of the universe. And we wanted to really make it clear that man is the measure, humankind, of course, right, is the measure of the machine. And so we then took over Theater Hall here and we said, all right, this is our building. This is going to take the shape of a human being. And so we sort of designated out, you're going to take the hand. So Abby Kleinert, who is very much, the consummate sort of maker, and says, no, we need to get our hands dirty. We need to be knuckle deep in these things if we are going to be making art. So she took over the hands. Chris Williams took over the guts, and in particular used the divination of Horspex of, you cut open the guts, you see how the innards spill out, and these will tell you things in order to use the outputs of ChatGPT as he built in this sort of oracle box that would spit out these omens, that it actually takes the human interpretation to make sense of the things that are coming out of it. And then Chris Przicki, who's very interested in accessibility and in thinking about, machines are made to smooth out rough edges, to replace things that we're doing. Well, what happens when the machine is in decline, right? And so what is it actually replacing? What do we lose? What happens when we're in decline? So he built out a language model that participants were able to interact with, but it was a model in decline where it was erroneous, where it was breaking up, and So we had these three things going on outside of the theater, out in the lobby. And of course, right, there is the nexus of the brain that in the human brings the outside world in together, processes it, and starts to try and make sense of it. So we can in turn act into the world again, right? And we can return that sort of energy. So we use the theater as our machine's brain. And Corpus Versum, which was my installation, was the attempt to do just that. So you'll have to kind of picture this with me, but on the stage of the theater, you've got the bright lights shining down. I brought in my home workstation, right? So 3 screens and all the little doodads and books and stacks of paper that might be on my desk, a very human sort of environment. And on each of these screens were different programs that I had built, both using generative AI and other types of AI, but that would then take human input and it would transform it. So when people would come into the Vitruvian machine, and they'd still be out in the lobby, they would get a ghost token. So one of Brian Eno's, based on Brian Eno's oblique strategies, these sort of little creative prods to kind of move you out of the way you're used to thinking about things, but done in a really sort of machine type language. And then they would feed these into, whether it was our AI in decline, whether it was our Oracle, and they would feed it in and they would get results back. So when they would feed these ghost tokens in whatever form they had taken at that point into Corpus Versum, the machine would essentially eat them. It would, they were sacrificing their lines of poetry, which is what I was asking them to do, is to use these to create some poems. And it would take them, it would then sacrifice it, it would generate an image, as well as a machine-generated line of poetry based on the human poetry. And so it would take a second because it was all hosted locally and it wasn't quite as snappy as maybe some of our enterprise models. But then it would show this image alongside both the human-generated poem and the machine-generated poem. Again, the machine-generated poem was using a very simple small language model. And so it was often pretty goofy, very stilted, what have you, but really to celebrate that human sort of intervention. Simultaneously, it would send that image and that line of poetry that the human had written out into the lobby, where it was projected against a large vinyl eye that was plastered against the window. So we're taking information in, we're sending it back out, and then once these poems have been written, they're sent off to a database, just used a Google Drive to host them, where the participant would be able to sort of realize the poem. So another thing I tell my students is that poetry is dead on the page until we give it our breath. And so I wanted to have this opportunity to do just that, to give the poem breath. And this starts with the participant speaking the name for the poem into a microphone, translated via speech to text. It is then fed into a music generator as well as a text-to-speech model, so that it would interrupt everything that was going on out in the lobby. It would clear its throat, this music would sort of pick up, and we'd have this machine rendition of the poem. Again, just another opportunity to take the things that we were creating, meld them with the machine, and to kind of make the artificial intelligence a medium as much as a partner in thought and in creation. And so I think there were a lot of things going on. We're poking against the weaknesses as they exist. We're celebrating the human, but we're also exemplifying ways that we can push beyond just this idea that, we use it to generate things. I actually think that's the weakest or the least valuable thing that these models are capable of doing. I think the more valuable thing is giving us opportunities for introspection, for reflection, for advancing our own thoughts. Back to that idea of augmenting our intelligence by giving us, ways to refract our ideas through and to bounce them off of.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for explaining the behind the scenes, because I came and visited and I definitely caught the uncanny valley sort of things feeling you can just grasp them, but you can't quite grasp them. And so it's really interesting to hear about the thought process and the design behind it all. I want to talk briefly about another project that the AI think tank did last semester, which I was more involved in, which was surveying faculty on their opinions of generative AI and how students are using it. And that was, I think, a more negative experience than the wonderful Vitruvian machine happening that you put on. And I wonder, were you surprised by sort of the negative feelings that we captured in that survey?
No, not at all. I think that partly because, again, I have these same reservations, maybe not to the same extent, certainly not always the same sort of reaction to them, but I feel them. They are real, and they are vocalized as they should be across the faculty. And so I wasn't necessarily surprised by some of the more negative perspectives, but it was nice to be able to provide an outlet for them so people know that they're being heard. And yeah, this is real. I mean, I think that anybody that is working in this sector feels many of these same things. The threats to our critical thinking, the threats to our creative thinking, just the threats to being able to form our own ideas and to maintain our own agency, right? And certainly when we're in an academic setting, the threats to just being able to learn, because learning requires trial and error. It requires failure. It doesn't require us just having this perfect, polished process in the first place. And then thinking about our colleagues that are working in traditionally creative fields, well, of course, this is a huge threat. So it wasn't surprising, but I do think that it was healthy to get those out so that we can, recognize them as being legitimate concerns, but then hopefully also to be able to address some of those concerns in more productive ways to figure out, okay, here's where we're at, right? But what does this really mean? Where do we go from here? And as a collective, as you know, one of the things that we settled on is some language around being a conscientious objector. And that idea being that, yeah, you can stand apart from the machine. Absolutely. That doesn't mean you're tech adverse. That doesn't mean that you don't understand things. In fact, it means that you do understand things and you have taken a moral or ethical position saying, hey, this is not where I'm at. And I think that is a completely credible, understandable, and supportable position to be in. And so I think it's really important that we have that space for people to express those ideas. And so having that survey was helpful in that regards, and helpful, I think, in helping us develop some approaches to maybe getting in front of some of those concerns, right? So if the concern is about learning, well, does that mean getting rid of it from the classroom at all, altogether? And how feasible is that? And if it's not completely feasible, what are some alternatives that we can use? And that might just be educating the students on the risks that they face if they shortchange their own thinking, their own creativity by going right to the machine, rather than, being okay with a little bit of failure as part of the learning process. Because why are you here?
Yeah. No, and I feel like that question resonates as a faculty member too. We feel like we're here to teach, but in reality, we're also here to assess. And I think that tension is really difficult because the traditional forms of assessment that we have, long answer exam questions, even multiple choice exam questions, we're suddenly having to rethink. And I don't think any of us ever enjoyed the assessment part of our job as the main part anyway.
There's a stack of paper on my desk. Yeah.
That's never the fun part. And so to add another challenge and difficulty to think through assessment has been hard on faculty.
Demoralizing.
Yeah.
I'll sit down and I will read a paper or a report, and it's very clear that it's, AI has been used to generate it, and to not as a partner, right? Not as a tool, but as a replacement for the student. And, so it is easy if you force yourself to still move through that, to become disillusioned, to become disheartened. But I think this is also an opportunity when when the spidey sense starts going off, to stop and to explain to the student exactly what's happening, particularly in writing. Listen, you've lost me. You've lost my interest because I am getting the sense that there isn't a strong voice here. Or to point out the hallucinations or the weak sort of logical links that AI is renowned for. And so in some ways, I think it allows us to actually up the ante for the students a little bit more and to be more forthright with our assessments, because it should no longer be a question about grammar, which is an easy thing to grade, but isn't really a useful thing to grade in my mind, right? More useful is to grade the thought processes behind the artifact we're seeing, the sort of logical connections and argument that is evolving from it, the sort of novelty, the surprise, and the usefulness if we're looking in a creative sort of venue. And I think that certainly in the written work, this allows us to actually demand more. But we have to make those demands then, and we need to be clear with them. And I think another thing that can help with this, right? And I'm very leery of anybody saying I've got a silver bullet for you. I don't think they exist because I haven't met a werewolf yet. But thinking about ways we can document provenance, I think, is a really useful way to put the onus not on the product, not on the grade, but on the making itself, and on that sort of documentation of the trial and error that you went through, of the struggles that the student embarked on. And this can allow us to take that scaffolding that we usually already build into our assignments, break it down even smaller so that we can see those thoughts evolving. We can jump inside, crawl inside their heads with them and kind of help them in that human to human sort of way, which lessens the sort of desire to use the machine, because it's not just on, you need to have this final polished product anymore. It's more like we need to see the evolution of this thinking and this idea and this piece throughout the entire process. So it becomes more process oriented than product oriented, which is what's going to help them make better products, I think, in the end anyhow. So I totally get it. But I think maybe this is an opportunity to rethink what we're doing and what we're trying to have the students accomplish.
Yeah. No, I think it is a great opportunity. I think that opportunity can be scary though, right?
Absolutely.
And taking it and working with it, I feel like in my own classes, I'm wrestling with, okay, I tried it this semester, it didn't really work. I'm going to try something different next semester. And I think we're all going to be in that sort of flux of trial and error for a little while yet before we do find that perfect solution. Before I have you go, though, Paul, I want to ask you about one more thing. So you have been the as far as I know, the brainchild behind bringing the server to campus. So can you tell me a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, so we are fortunate enough to have the support of our deans across all 4 colleges, administration up through the provost and the chancellor, to get behind this idea that, hey, listen, if we're going to address the impacts and the practices surrounding these technologies, we do, in Kleinert's words, need to get knuckle deep in it, right? We need to actually get our hands dirty. And so on the back of the Vitruvian machine, I said, listen, I can build this on my computer, but I can't host it, so I've got a problem of obsolescence. So there's a little bit of selfishness in there, for sure. But also that, if we can bring some of these technologies that can be very expensive, but can also be relatively affordable onto campus, we can create a opportunity for experimentation, for research and exploration, and for building out these things in a more stable way, in a way that can be more clearly documented and really allow UWGB to become a leader in this area, certainly within the region. But I don't believe in thinking small. I think it provides an opportunity for us to be a leader across the country and maybe beyond. And so it allows us to build new tools. It allows us to play with this machine and to break it in ways that you can't when you're using somebody else's, right? So you're using ChatGPT, you're using Gemini, any of these things. You don't have the same level of control over it. Likewise, if we're thinking about using it in an educational context, it allows us to control our own data and not rely on the promises of Microsoft or any other major player who says, "Oh no, certainly we won't use your data to train our models." Right? I take that with a very large grain of salt, and it also allows us not just that privacy, but it allows us a layer of security that outside vendors can't always promise. So we have this laboratory I'll be launching next semester, where we can build the tools that we need using this server, right? And we can do the experiments that interest us. And we're not just being fed somebody else's sort of tool. We're actually saying, no, we are tool makers. We are the humans in this sort of relationship. And I think that's a powerful opportunity. And I think that really great things will come from that as we build a AI literate body of faculty and staff that see themselves as capable of doing that, because it doesn't take the same lift that I think sometimes from the outside we think it does. And moreover, it's all 4 of our colleges. It is the best of interdisciplinary thinking. It allows us to create teams between the English department and computer science. It allows us to, build tools beyond just what one person or one department is capable of. So I imagine that we are going to be having more sort of brilliant, original, unusual ideas and tools emerging from this exercise.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what it becomes. It's definitely an exciting, very future forward thinking project. So thank you so much for joining me today, Paul, and telling me about it. It was wonderful to chat with you about this.
Thank you for having me so much. It's been excellent.
Psychology and Stuff is brought to you by Good Cause Productions at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. The executive producer is Ryan Martin, the production manager is Rachel Sankey, and our creative director is Jenny Young. The media engineer for this episode is Kennedy Punke. Special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Paul Belanger. If you haven't already, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. I'm your host, Alison Jane Martingano. Keep being amazing.